Today we come together to honour those nearly 160,000 British, Commonwealth and Allied troops who, on the 5th of June 1944, assembled here and along these shores to embark on the mission which would strike that blow for freedom and be recorded as the greatest amphibious operation in history.
Something no one saw coming just happened. King Charles made a shocking announcement that sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. Within 60 seconds, Camilla watched her entire world crumble before millions of viewers. Royal insiders are calling this the biggest crisis in centuries. You won't believe what they're saying about Camilla. This changes everything about the monarchy forever.
Around the world, far too many people continue to face unimaginable pain, suffering, and loss, whether through natural disasters or man-made conflict and famine. We are witnesses to the appalling suffering of those who are victims of war and violence, from Ukraine to Sudan, from Myanmar to Haiti, and indeed throughout much of the Middle East.
The morning started like any other day at Buckingham Palace. King Charles was at his desk, working through official correspondence with his usual attention to detail. In another part of the palace, Queen Camilla was getting ready for a charity luncheon she was scheduled to attend later that day. She was carefully choosing her outfit, something she had done countless times over the years, as she gradually took on more public duties. Meanwhile, Prince William was several miles away, deep in meetings about an upcoming environmental summit he was planning to host. None of them had any idea that their lives were about to change completely. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, Sir Clive Alderton, who served as the King's private secretary, walked into Charles's study. He was not alone. Walking beside him were the Attorney General, the Lord Chancellor, and 2 senior members of Parliament. The fact that all these important officials had arrived together at such an early hour was highly unusual. Their expressions were serious, and they moved with a sense of urgency that immediately caught the King's attention. Sir Clive spoke first, keeping his voice low but clear. He informed the King that they had received credible intelligence about a significant security threat against the crown. He explained that immediate constitutional action would be required to protect the monarchy. King Charles put down his pen and looked directly at the group of officials standing before him. He asked them to explain exactly what kind of threat they were talking about. The Attorney General stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the King's desk. Inside were documents that painted a troubling picture. According to the intelligence they had gathered, there was a coordinated plot involving both foreign actors and domestic collaborators. The aim of this plot was to destabilize the British monarchy by releasing highly classified information to the public. The threat level was described as critical and immediate, meaning that action needed to be taken right away. The folder contained evidence of financial irregularities in royal trusts, communications with certain world leaders that had not been verified but could be politically explosive if made public, and testimony suggesting that some trusted members of the royal household had been passing sensitive details to hostile intelligence networks for years. The information was serious enough that the Prime Minister had already been informed about the situation. The Lord Chancellor added his perspective to the conversation. He explained that the security services were recommending that responsibility for the crown be transferred immediately to the next person in line for the throne. While this transfer would be temporary, it was considered necessary to protect the institution of the monarchy itself. The officials believed that if King Charles remained on the throne during this crisis, the entire institution could face damage that might be impossible to repair. King Charles sat back in his chair, taking in the full weight of what was being suggested to him. He stated plainly what everyone in the room already understood. They were suggesting that he abdicate the throne. Sir Clive's voice became softer as he responded. He confirmed that yes, they were recommending abdication, but it would be temporary in nature. However, he emphasized that if the king remained in place while this crisis unfolded, the monarchy as an institution could face harm that would last for generations. While all of this was happening in the king's study, Queen Camilla remained completely unaware of the crisis developing just rooms away. She was standing in her dressing room, holding a sapphire brooch up to her jacket to see how it looked. For her, this was simply another day in a royal schedule that was always packed with obligations and public appearances. She had no way of knowing that her position, her public standing, and her entire life as queen consort were now hanging by a thread. For the next 3 hours, constitutional advisors moved in and out of the king's study. Every possible legal mechanism was carefully discussed. Every potential consequence was weighed and considered. The intelligence briefing had made it clear that public exposure of the security threat could happen within a single day. If the royal family and their advisors acted quickly and decisively, they could present the transition as a planned modernization of the monarchy. If they waited and did nothing, the revelation would likely erupt as a major scandal that could shake public confidence in the institution. Time was no longer something they had the luxury of wasting. The decision about whether to abdicate rested entirely with King Charles. He had waited 73 years to become king, longer than any heir in British history. He had finally ascended to the throne after his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, passed away, and his coronation had taken place just 2 years and 3 months earlier. Now he was being asked to consider giving up the crown he had waited his entire life to wear. The security briefing had been more alarming than anything Charles could have imagined. According to the intelligence services, foreign governments had apparently been collecting information about the royal family for years. They had built up a substantial collection of documents and communications that could potentially be used as weapons to destroy public confidence in the monarchy. The threat was not just aimed at Charles personally, but at the entire institution and everyone connected to it. Phone calls were already being made to arrange for Prince William to return to Buckingham Palace from his environmental meetings. Senior members of the royal household were being quietly alerted that a constitutional emergency was in progress. The complex machinery that keeps the monarchy running was preparing for a transition that no one had ever expected would happen this way, and certainly not this quickly. The irony of the situation was not lost on King Charles. He had spent more than 7 decades preparing to be king. He had studied constitutional law, learned about the history of the monarchy, built relationships with world leaders, and developed expertise in areas like architecture and environmental conservation. He had waited patiently while his mother enjoyed the longest reign in British history. And now, after finally achieving the role he had prepared for his entire life, he was being asked to step aside after barely 2 years on the throne. At 11:45, King Charles made the decision that he needed to speak with Camilla before talking to anyone else about what he was planning to do. He found her in her private sitting room, where she was reviewing notes for the speech she was supposed to give at the charity luncheon later that day. When she looked up and saw the expression on his face, the smile she had been wearing immediately froze. She could tell something was seriously wrong. Camilla asked him what had happened, noting that he looked like he had seen a ghost. Charles sat down heavily in the chair across from her, and in that moment, he suddenly looked every one of his 76 years. He told her that something had happened, something that was going to change everything for both of them. He then began to explain the morning's events as gently as he possibly could, watching as his wife's face transformed from confusion to disbelief, and then to dawning horror. When Charles reached the part about the recommended abdication, Camilla's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She whispered that they wanted him to give up the throne. After everything the two of them had been through to get to this point, after all the years of public criticism and gradual acceptance, it was now being taken away. Charles replied that it was not really about what anyone wanted. It was about survival. He explained that if the classified information became public while he was still king, it could potentially destroy the monarchy entirely. But if he abdicated now, William could start fresh without being tainted by scandal. Camilla stood up abruptly and walked over to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. She asked what would happen to them, to their life together. She reminded Charles that she had spent 17 years as his wife, building relationships with charitable organizations, establishing her role within the royal family, and working hard to gain public acceptance. Now he was telling her that it was all going to end because of some conspiracy that they had no control over. The pain in her voice was clear and heartbreaking. Charles understood exactly what this meant for Camilla on a personal level. Becoming queen consort had represented validation after decades of being vilified by the public and the press. She had started her relationship with Charles while he was still married to Princess Diana, and the public had never fully forgiven her for that. It had taken years of dedicated charity work, public service, and dignified behavior for her to finally achieve a measure of acceptance and respect. Now, just when she had reached the position she had worked so hard to attain, it was being snatched away by circumstances that were completely beyond anyone's control. Charles told Camilla quietly that William would need their support during this transition. He pointed out that it would not be easy for William either, as he was not yet prepared to be king. Camilla repeated William's name, and Charles caught something bitter in her tone. She referred to William as someone who could do no wrong in the public's eyes, someone who would of course be fine because he had Catherine by his side, he had his perfect children, and he had the memory of his mother Diana to guide him. The reference to Diana was painful for Charles to hear, but he understood where his wife's anguish was coming from. Camilla had worked incredibly hard to step out of Diana's shadow and establish her own legacy within the royal family. Diana had been immensely popular with the public, beloved as the people's princess, and her tragic death in 1997 had cemented her status as an icon. Camilla had spent years trying to create her own identity, separate from comparisons to Diana. Now she was being asked to step aside for Diana's son, the golden boy who had never had to fight for public acceptance the way she had. While Charles and Camilla were having this difficult conversation, Prince William was in the middle of a heated discussion about carbon emissions with a group of environmental scientists. His private secretary appeared at the conference room door with an expression that immediately commanded attention. The discreet hand signal he gave meant one thing and one thing only. There was urgent royal business that could not wait. William excused himself from the meeting and stepped out into the corridor where his secretary, James Harrison, was waiting. James looked visibly anxious as he explained that William needed to return to Buckingham Palace immediately. The king had requested his presence for a matter of constitutional urgency. William felt his stomach drop. The phrase constitutional urgency could mean many different things, but none of them were good. His grandfather's death had been handled with constitutional precision, but the phrase suggested something different was happening now. Something unprecedented. William asked what kind of constitutional urgency they were dealing with as they walked quickly toward his waiting car. James admitted that he was not privy to the specific details, but he had been told to inform William that the Lord Chancellor and the Attorney General were involved, along with senior members of the security services. The 20-minute drive back to Buckingham Palace felt much longer, as William's mind raced through various possibilities. Has there been some kind of attack? Was there a threat against his children? Had his father suddenly fallen ill? None of the scenarios he imagined in his head prepared him for what he would actually find when he arrived at the palace. Catherine had also been summoned to Buckingham Palace, having been called away from her own engagements with equal urgency. She and William met in the corridor outside the king's study, both of them wearing expressions of confused concern. Catherine asked if William knew what this was about. William replied that he had no idea, but whatever it was, it could not be good. Just then, the study door opened, and Sir Clive Alderton appeared. He thanked them for coming so quickly, and told them that His Majesty was ready to see them now. They walked into the study to find King Charles sitting behind his desk, looking older and more fragile than William had ever seen him before. The abdication documents were spread across the desktop, and even without being told what they were, their significance was immediately apparent. Charles asked William and Catherine to sit down, his voice heavy with emotion. He told them that he had something extraordinary to share, and he needed them to understand that what he was about to say would change everything for their family. William sat in stunned silence as his father explained the security crisis, the threat to the monarchy, and the unanimous recommendation from constitutional experts and security advisors that he should abdicate immediately. Each word felt surreal to William, as if he were hearing about someone else's life rather than his own. When Charles finished speaking, William said what both of them already knew. His father was asking him to become king today, right now, with no warning or preparation. Charles corrected him gently. He was not just asking William to become king. He was asking William to save the monarchy. Charles explained that William was the only one who could do this. William had the public's trust in a way that Charles himself might have lost before he even had a real chance to earn it. The younger generation saw William as a modern, relatable figure. He and Catherine were seen as a stable, loving couple with a normal family life. The public trusted them in a way that would be crucial during this crisis. Catherine's hand tightened on William's arm, and he could feel her trembling slightly. At 41 years old, she had been preparing mentally for the possibility of becoming queen one day, but not for decades yet. They had assumed they would have many more years to prepare their children, to gradually take on more responsibilities, and to transition into their roles when the time felt right. The idea of becoming queen immediately, with 3 young children at home who still needed their parents, was completely overwhelming. William asked about Camilla, and Charles's expression grew even more painful. He admitted that this was the hardest part of the entire situation. Camilla was devastated, as anyone could imagine. She had spent 20 years building her role in the royal family, working to gain acceptance and establish herself as a valuable member of the institution. Now it was ending almost before it had truly begun. She had been queen consort for just over 2 years, and now she would have to watch as someone else took her place. The next few hours passed in what felt like a complete blur of constitutional procedures, legal briefings, and emergency protocols that had never actually been used in modern times. William found himself being thrust into intensive crash courses on abdication law, succession procedures, and the immediate responsibilities that came with being king. The most challenging part of the entire situation was the timeline they were working with. To prevent the security crisis from becoming public knowledge before the transition was complete, everything had to happen within hours, rather than the months that were typically required for royal succession. The coronation ceremony would need to be stripped down to its most basic elements. It would be a simple swearing in, rather than the elaborate pageantry that was usually associated with crowning a new monarch. The Lord Chancellor explained, during one of the many rapid-fire briefings, that the full coronation with all its traditional ceremony could happen later, perhaps in a year or 2. For today, they only needed the essential constitutional elements: the oath, the formal recognition, and the official investiture of authority. Those were the only things that truly mattered from a legal standpoint. Meanwhile, palace staff were working frantically behind the scenes to prepare the throne room for an emergency ceremony. Furniture was being rearranged, camera positions were being set up, and security was being coordinated. Television networks were being quietly alerted that a major royal announcement was coming, though none of them were being told the specific nature of the news that was about to break. The palace wanted to control the message and the timing as much as possible. William spent close to an hour with constitutional lawyers, learning the precise wording of the oaths he would need to take. The traditional coronation ceremony would be compressed down to its most essential elements, but every single word had to be exactly right to ensure the legal legitimacy of the transition. There could be no mistakes, no stumbling over words, no room for anyone to question whether the transfer of power had been done properly. Catherine was dealing with her own set of practical challenges related to suddenly becoming queen. Her lady-in-waiting was hastily putting together appropriate attire for the ceremony, pulling dresses from her wardrobe, and trying to find something that would be formal enough for a coronation, but could be ready within hours. Her private secretary had begun the enormous task of clearing her schedule for the coming weeks and preparing for the massive increase in responsibilities that would come with her new role as queen consort. The hardest conversation of the entire day was the one they needed to have with their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis had to be told that their father was about to become king, which meant that their entire lives were about to change in ways they could not fully understand yet. 10-year-old George asked if they would still be able to live at home. Catherine assured him that yes, they would, although she was not entirely certain herself what the living arrangements would look like going forward. Some things would definitely change, she told him, but they would still be a family, no matter what. 8-year-old Charlotte seemed most concerned about the everyday practical matters. She wanted to know if her father would still be able to help her with her homework in the evenings. William told her that he would always make time for what was truly important, though he was hoping desperately that he would actually be able to keep that promise. 5-year-old Louis simply asked if this meant he would be a prince now, not understanding that he already was one, and that his future role in the royal family had just become infinitely more significant than it had been before. The emotional weight of what was happening was becoming almost unbearable for everyone involved. William kept thinking about how much his life was about to change, how the freedom and relative privacy he had managed to maintain would disappear forever. Catherine was trying to process the reality that she would become one of the most closely watched and scrutinized women in the entire world, literally overnight. But perhaps no one was struggling more with the situation than Camilla, who had spent the afternoon shut away in her private quarters, trying to come to terms with the reality that her brief time as queen consort was about to end before most people even knew it had truly begun. Camilla sat in her private sitting room, surrounded by all the symbols of a role she was about to lose. The official portraits that had been taken just months earlier, during Charles's coronation, seemed to mock her from their frames on the walls. The invitations to state dinners that were stacked on her desk, the carefully planned charitable engagements that filled her calendar, the slowly built relationships with world leaders and dignitaries. All of it was about to become irrelevant history. Her lady-in-waiting, Dame Philippa Morrison, had been with her for over a decade and understood better than anyone else what this transition meant for Camilla on a personal level. She found her employer staring out at the palace gardens, her face showing a level of devastation that was difficult to witness. Philippa spoke softly, reminding Camilla that the ceremony would begin in just 2 hours and asking if she should help her get ready. Camilla turned away from the window, and Philippa was genuinely shocked to see tears in her eyes. In all their years together, through media scandals and harsh public criticism, through the long, difficult journey from being seen as the other woman to becoming the wife and then the queen consort, Philippa had never once seen Camilla cry. Camilla asked what exactly she was supposed to be preparing for. Was she getting ready to watch her stepson take the throne that her husband was being forced to give up? Was she supposed to smile graciously while everything she had worked toward for 2 decades simply disappeared? Philippa replied gently that Camilla was preparing to support the family through an impossible situation, which was something she had always done. Camilla laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. She asked Philippa if she knew what was truly ironic about this whole situation. She had spent 20 years trying to prove that she belonged in the royal family, trying to earn her place and show that she could be a valuable contributing member. And now she was being pushed out of the central role by the same establishment forces that had once helped protect and support the monarchy. The reference was to the same advisors and officials who had once supported her marriage to Charles as a stabilizing influence, people who had helped orchestrate her gradual acceptance by the public. Those same people were now engineering her removal from center stage. The very individuals who had worked to help her achieve acceptance were now the ones making sure she stepped back into the shadows. Philippa tried to comfort her by pointing out that she was not really being pushed out of the family. She would still be married to the king's father. She would still have her place within the royal structure. But Camilla was not consoled by these words. She asked what that place would actually be. Would she be the former queen consort? the woman who held the title for less than 2 years. She said she would end up being nothing more than a footnote in royal history, remembered mainly for how briefly she had mattered. The pain that came through in Camilla's voice was truly devastating to hear. She had endured decades of public hatred and vilification, slowly rebuilding her reputation through dedicated charitable work and dignified public service. The role of Queen Consort had represented the ultimate validation for her, proof that she had finally earned her place in the royal family through sheer persistence and dedication. Now that validation was being stripped away, and it was not even because of anything she had done wrong. It was purely because of circumstances that were entirely beyond her control. The throne room at Buckingham Palace had been transformed with remarkable speed into a setting that would be appropriate for an emergency coronation. Television cameras lined the walls of the historic room, their red recording lights creating an atmosphere that felt both surreal and intensely charged. Representatives from Parliament, the Church of England, and the Commonwealth had been hastily assembled to witness what would become the most unprecedented transfer of power in modern British history. William stood in a small antechamber just off the main throne room, adjusting the ceremonial robes that had been quickly altered to fit his frame. The weight of the fabric seemed like nothing compared to the weight of responsibility that was about to settle permanently on his shoulders. In less than an hour, he would officially become King of the United Kingdom and 15 Commonwealth realms, head of the Church of England, and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. It was a role he had always known would eventually be his, but he had expected to have decades more to prepare. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been summoned urgently from a conference he was attending in York, asked William if he was ready. William replied honestly that he was as ready as anyone could be for something like this. How could anyone truly prepare for becoming a monarch with only a few hours' notice? Catherine appeared beside him, looking elegant in a hastily chosen navy dress that would have to serve as her coronation attire. Her face was pale, but her expression showed the same steely determination that had seen her through years of intense public scrutiny and media attention. Catherine reached out and took William's hand, asking if they were ready to do this together. William confirmed that yes, they were doing this together, intertwining his fingers with hers. The great doors of the throne room opened, and they walked forward together to face their destiny. The assembled dignitaries all rose to their feet as William and Catherine entered, and the weight of centuries of history seemed to settle over the ancient space. Television cameras captured every single step they took, broadcasting the moment to a world that was only just beginning to learn what was actually happening. King Charles was already seated on a chair positioned beside the throne, wearing his full ceremonial robes for what would be the last time as monarch. His face clearly showed the strain of the day's events, but there was also a resigned dignity in his bearing that spoke to his understanding of why this transition was necessary. And there in the front row of witnesses sat Camilla. She had chosen to wear a deep purple dress, a color that held significance as both the traditional color of mourning and also a color associated with royalty. Her jewelry was understated and elegant, her makeup was flawless, and her expression was carefully neutral. But those who knew her well could easily see the tension in her shoulders and the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her small handbag. The ceremony began, with the Archbishop making a solemn announcement about the circumstances that had made this unprecedented gathering necessary. His words had been very carefully chosen to frame the abdication as a selfless act of service to the nation rather than a crisis-driven departure. He stated that they were gathering today under exceptional circumstances, and that His Majesty King Charles III had chosen to place the welfare of the realm above all personal considerations, passing the sacred trust of kingship to his son and heir. As the formal words of abdication were read aloud, the television cameras found Camilla's face in the crowd. Viewers around the world watched as her carefully maintained composure began to visibly crack. Her face grew noticeably paler with each constitutional phrase that formally ended her husband's reign, and, by extension, her own role as queen consort. The moment that would be replayed endlessly in news coverage for days and weeks to come happened when Charles formally renounced the throne. as the words left Charles's mouth, declaring that he did solemnly and sincerely abdicate and renounce for himself and his heirs the throne of the United Kingdom, Camilla's face went completely white. The cameras captured every single nuance of her shock and devastation, broadcasting her private anguish to millions of viewers who were witnessing the most dramatic royal transition that had occurred in modern times. It was a deeply personal moment of pain being played out on the most public stage imaginable. The constitutional machinery of abdication moved forward with the kind of ancient precision that the British monarchy had perfected over centuries, even as the ceremony itself unfolded with completely unprecedented speed. King Charles signed the formal documents that would transfer all royal prerogatives and powers to his son. Each stroke of his pen across the paper marked another step in Camilla's descent from the heights of power and influence she had finally achieved. Charles spoke clearly as he made his declaration, stating that he solemnly and sincerely renounced and abdicated all his rights, privileges, and dignities as king. He called upon God to witness this renunciation, and he prayed that God would graciously bless his son William as he assumed the sacred trust that Charles was now relinquishing. His voice was steady, but carried the unmistakable weight of emotion. The cameras swept across all the assembled witnesses. The Prime Minister and cabinet members sat in solemn attention. Commonwealth representatives from various nations watched with serious expressions. Senior clergy from the Church of England bore witness to this historic moment. Members of the royal family were present, all of them watching in what appeared to be stunned silence as the crown passed from father to son, under circumstances that absolutely no one could have foreseen, even 24 hours earlier. Camilla's reaction quickly became the emotional centerpiece of the entire day. As Charles spoke the final words that would officially end his reign, she swayed slightly in her seat. Dame Philippa, who was seated directly beside her, discreetly reached out to steady her while managing to maintain a composed expression for the benefit of the cameras. The color had completely drained from Camilla's face, leaving her looking almost ghostly pale against the deep purple fabric of her dress. Her hands continued to tremble visibly as she watched her husband surrender the crown he had waited 73 years to receive, and with it, her own brief moment as the highest-ranking woman in the entire realm. When William stepped forward to take his oath as the new king, Camilla's composure finally cracked in a way that was impossible to hide. A single tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but not before the cameras had caught it for posterity and for history. The Archbishop's voice rang out clearly through the throne room as he asked William if he would solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, along with his other realms and territories, according to their respective laws and customs. William's response was steady and resolute, as he stated that he solemnly promised to do so. Camilla sat watching, realizing that she was witnessing the boy she had first known when he was just 15 years old, transform into the king she would now have to serve. She was no longer his equal in rank. The shift in their relationship was immediate and complete. The most devastating moment came when the crown was actually placed upon William's head. It was a much more stripped-back version of the elaborate coronations of the past, yet the symbolism was absolutely immense and powerful. At 41 years old, William Arthur Philip Lewis officially became King William V, and Camilla Parker Bowles became once again simply the wife of a former king. The transformation was sealed when all the assembled dignitaries proclaimed in unison that God save the king. Their voices echoed through the throne room and carried across television airwaves to a watching world. Catherine maintained perfect royal composure throughout the ceremony, though careful observers could see a flicker of strain cross her face as her husband accepted a burden that neither of them had expected to carry for decades. As the ceremony drew to a close, and William prepared to address the nation for the first time as king, Camilla remained frozen in her seat, unable to move or react. In the space of just 8 hours, she had gone from being queen consort to being a former queen consort, from being the second most important woman in Britain to being a supporting figure in someone else's reign.